Blessed be everyone, and welcome to another episode of Which Please. It's I, Odin Nasir. Today I wanted to talk about something that is very near and dear to my heart, and that is my grandmother, Miss Dorothy Juliette Carrière. My grandmother has probably been the most influential part of my life and has really been the foundation to all of my growth and development. Even though my grandmother had a life that was not necessarily the most picturesque, my grandmother suffered greatly throughout her time. But she always had a way of putting things into perspective that I have yet to find in anyone else. My grandmother was the type of woman who people would show up at our front doors with garbage bags and their children and say to my grandmother, "I can't take care of my child anymore." My grandmother would just take the children in and raise them for years and years. And then when the parents were ready and able to take care of their children again, they would come and pick up these children, and my grandmother would let them go lovingly and always let these people know that you can come back at any time. When you're knocked down, you're drug out, and you need someone to help you, my doors are always open. This woman had a way of transforming people's lives. And she never preached. Nanny's whole power was all based on action. It was who she was. It's who she is. When I was growing up, I struggled a lot when it came to understanding who I was and who I am and trying to find myself. And my grandmother never talked down to me. She never tried to make me feel that what I was doing was wrong or that I wasn't fit for a certain thing. My grandmother used to always be like, "Baby, find what's inside of you. It may not be what everyone else wants, but if it feels right to you, then it's right." I had the luxury of being raised by this woman who empowered me. My grandmother never, ever, in the whole time that I knew her, passed judgment on this living soul. It was not part of her nature. I remember once I was out having dinner with one of my aunties, and we were talking. This woman said to me that one of my uncles was in fact not really my grandmother's child. And of course I got upset, and I was like, "How are you going to tell me that this is not my grandmother's child? I know who my grandmother's children are." When I went back home and was talking to my grandmother, I told her. I said, "This person told me that this person's not your son." My grandmother said, "Well, he's not really my son." And I was taken aback, and I was like, "What do you mean it's not your son?" And my grandmother went on to tell me that my grandfather, who was an alcoholic and very abusive, had had an affair on her. And the woman became pregnant, but could not take care of the child. So my grandmother took that child into her home and raised it as her child. There was never controversy. There was never a mention of the fact of him not being her son. Because that was not my grandma. That was her child. When she told me this, I remember saying to her, "Nanny, how could you have done that?" My grandmother said, "It is a right for a child to be born with all the opportunities in the world. People make mistakes. But that mistake doesn't have to affect the child for the rest of their life." My grandmother has and will always be someone that I gauge the decisions that I make in life on. What would Nanny do? When I was about 23 years old, my grandmother taught me one of the strongest, most powerful lessons I think I've ever learned. I got a call from her one day, and she said to me, "Baby, you need to come down and see Nanny. When Nanny calls you and tells you you need to come down and see her, because you have to be face to face, you know it's not always going to be good. And there's a certain level of terror that you feel right in the core, the very essence of who you are." I got on that bus, and I think that was the longest bus ride I've ever taken in my life. And when I got to Nanny's house, I said to her, "Nanny, just tell me, what's going on?" She said, "Sit down, babe." And she said to me, "Jer, Nanny has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's." And I started to cry instantly. I was so angry with God. And I started to lash out. And I said to her, "How could God do this to you? Out of all the people in the world, there's people who are hateful, who try and destroy, who don't love and don't care about anybody. How could God do this to you, the one person in this world that is nothing but love? Why?" Now, my grandmother has had a hard life. When she was 8 years old, my great-grandmother's first husband had left her, and my great-grandmother had found another man. And this man told my great-grandmother that he did not want to raise anyone else's children. So, my great-grandmother didn't have the strength to take my grandma to the orphanage. So at 8, she put her on a bus, told her where to get off. And my grandmother checked herself in to an orphanage. My grandmother stayed in that orphanage until she was 16 years old, which is the time that my great-grandmother's second husband left her, of which my great-grandmother sent for my grandmother, and my grandmother left the orphanage, came back home, and proceeded to work and support the family. My grandmother also took care of my great-grandmother in her final days, final years actually. Now, I had witnessed my great-grandmother go through Alzheimer's, so I knew how painful it was and how deteriorating it was to body and mind. So when my grandmother told me that she was going to suffer the same fate, all I could feel was pain and anger. And while I was sitting on her couch crying and cursing God for what he did, my grandmother looked at me and said, "Baby, don't be angry. Nanny's had a hard life, and all I've ever wanted to do was forget. And now, by the grace of God, I will." And I stopped crying instantly. She liberated me. That woman, facing what she was going to face, was able to give me peace. Now, yes, I'm crying now. But I'm not crying for pain. I'm crying because of the love that I feel for my grandma. And how blessed I am that she was the one who raised me. So for those of you who are out there, who are going through difficult times, sometimes a little change of perspective can make the world a difference. I wanted to share this with y'all because it's very important to me to bring you into my life and get you to understand how and why I am the way that I am, and the blessings that were given to me by this beautiful woman. And Nanny, when you watch this, I couldn't thank you enough for creating who I've become and for allowing me and giving me the knowledge to pass this on to not just my child, but to anybody who's willing to listen. I love you, Nanny. You are my heart, and you have never steered me wrong.